wanted to introduce, for some of you, not an introduction, but Jim Ledbetter. Jim, formerly the editor-in-chief of Inc. for about 6 years, spent the past year at Sequoia, and Jim has joined Clara Media as our Chief Content Officer. We'll also be, again, working very closely with all of our brands, help put together today's session. Jim, before we get started, a couple words, your thoughts?
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. Very happy to be here. Very happy to see my former colleague, Christine Ligorio. I think it's going to be a great discussion. And just for the record, I interpreted Let It Be as a laissez-faire free speech attitude toward power media, but maybe we'll debate that.
Great. I really just put on British classics, but I'm glad you guys are seeing deeper meaning.
We thought it was much more strategic than that, but no, it was great, and love to come out to Queen. What a powerful song. But no, thanks Jim, and you'll be seeing more of Jim throughout all of our events. Obviously we'll be continuing. Many of you have attended our roundtables like this one. These will continue all year. In addition, you'll be learning about our tentpole multi-day events that we'll be launching starting late February with our CDX Accelerate event. So excited about all of those. As many of you know, and some of you, excuse me, are our members. We launched our membership program last year, which is for some of our community members to engage more as part of a network. We will be hosting a bespoke member event following this in a smaller conversation. So we'll be sending you information about that. Obviously, I think today is an important topic and really timely, especially as things are happening with the big tech platforms being in the news. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to David to set the stage and introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Josh, and great to have Jim with us. It really makes a big difference around here. So wonderful, wonderful news. Okay, here our great panelists are, and I want to introduce them. All three of them are authors and journalists of longstanding with a tremendous background in tech. Our topic, of course, being the power of big tech. Where does it go from here? In a time when the obvious, there's reason, it's obvious why we decided to have a session on that this week with all of the recent developments surrounding the termination of Trump's Twitter account and many other things that have flowed directly or indirectly from that. Some big changes on the internet and big behavioral shifts by the tech giants just in the last week, but really culminating years and years, or at least underscoring years and years of tremendous uncertainty about the relationship between these platforms and society. Okay, I'm going to start with introducing Sarah Frier, who is the author of No Filter, The Inside Story of Instagram. And the reason I'm starting with her is to congratulate her for recently winning the Business Book of the Year award from the Financial Times and McKinsey. That's a huge honor and a big deal. And I'm really happy that she got that, and I'm happy she's here to give us some of her insights, which are many. Christine Ligorio-Chafkin is also an author. She wrote a book called We Are the Nerds, The Birth and Tumultuous Life of Reddit, the Internet's Culture Laboratory. And she is also a senior writer at Inc. magazine. And we're really happy to have her at our first Techonomy event. The other two are veterans, but this won't be your last, Christine. Finally, Alex Kantrowitz, somebody who many of you do know because he's been with us before, a longtime BuzzFeed journalist and author of Always Day One, How the Tech Titans Plan to Stay on Top Forever, which is a very pertinent title. Now author of the Big Technology Newsletter, a Substack partisan who's gone off on his own. So there we have the big picture of who we have. I want to start by asking well, wait, before I start, let's share the results of the poll just to show how interestingly optimistic this group is, the audience here, about where we stand, or certainly supportive, maybe supportive of government, supportive of Twitter for taking down Trump, um, believing as a group that it's not too late and these giants are not too big to regulate. That may be a controversial point of view in our upcoming discussion. People think that under Biden, the relationship between big tech and government will be more productive. That's probably hard to argue. Section 230 will not be revoked. It might be tweaked. Okay, well, that's where the poll came out. So let's start, and maybe I'll start with Christine, our newcomer, and to just sort of address what's happened this week. And it isn't just that Twitter kicked off Trump and that Facebook is pretty much about to permanently ban Trump, we believe, but it really extended into some really surprising subsequent moves by, for example, Amazon to kick off Parler from AWS, even Stripe to no longer be willing to process contributions to the Trump campaign. We have seen a wholesale shift in the attitude of a lot of big tech companies about what they should do in response to speech that suggests illegal behavior, I guess, is a big picture summary. What do you think about what happened this week, Christine? And do you think it was an overreaction?
Well, first off, thank you for having me here, David. This is fantastic, and I appreciate everyone welcoming me for the first time. But yeah, this has been a real week, and I think that Twitter's move really kicked off a wave in Silicon Valley, and I think it shows exactly the power of these big platforms to be a first mover that causes just a wave. I mean, it's not just the companies you mentioned, Airbnb, GoFundMe. There's everything down to like Zendesk, and a little niche film review site called Letterbox said that Trump can't post reviews of the films there. I mean, it's everyone, and I think it shows the power of Twitter and of a single entity, and that I think is something fascinating to discuss because while I can say definitively it was a good move, and that these platforms should not allow posts that incite violence. They never should have, never has it been in their policies to allow that. Whether this does signal that these giants have gained too much power over the years through the way their algorithms are designed, and are those algorithms something that can be regulated? Can we get into that? I think that's going to be a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to get into the algorithm, so thank you for raising that. And I'll just want to mention Esther Dyson, a longtime Techonomy community member, points out that I should have included in my intro the fact of the violence in the Capitol. I guess I assume that's kind of in the background of everybody's head, but thank you, Esther, and thank you as always for being here. So, Sarah, what do you think? How bad are these companies too powerful, and was this an overreaction? Try both of those.
I think a lot of people are saying, the opposite opinion, which is that they made it clear that they could have done this at any moment. There are other times that Trump has incited violence with his rhetoric. There are other times that he's crossed the line. Obviously, the violence in the Capitol was a huge violent moment that he was a part of instigating. But a lot of the sentiment from folks I've talked to is like, well, see how easy that was? Did they really have to wait until after it was clear that the next Senate majority was going to be Democratic, that the president was going to be a Democrat, that we had, actual risk to human life? Why did they let it bubble up to that point? And so I'm with Christine in that whether or not they should ban Donald Trump, or whether or not they should ban any individual contribution to the website is a good question. But the better question is, how did the structural incentives in Facebook, in Twitter, in Instagram allow tensions to bubble to this point, allow people to become so polarized, and bring us to a place where we have people that have very different senses of what the reality is. What are the things that cause anger and division and polarization to become a natural consequence of Facebook and Twitter scale? And so I think those are the more interesting questions that, now that Trump is not the lightning pole of should they or shouldn't they take down this one individual post, I hope we can have a broader discussion about those incentives built into the platforms.
Do you think these companies in general are too powerful?
I think that their power is untransparent. I think that their power is a black box to most people. Too powerful is, yes, because they are not, there's nobody calling them or able to say, how does this actually work? Tell us how this works. And once we see it, we're only believing what Facebook and Twitter tell us about what's working and what isn't working. We're not able to actually look at, when Facebook puts out their quote unquote transparency reports about we removed 80% of hate speech before users saw it. There needs to be an audit of that. There needs to be somebody looking and saying, okay, how well does your AI actually work? And how does leaning on your AI for content moderation affect people that it shouldn't affect? Are you taking down posts that you shouldn't be taking down? How are you actually enacting this moderation for 3+ billion users on Facebook and hundreds of millions on Twitter, with the idea that anyone who does get moderated has really no recourse, nobody to talk to, no way to make it right? I think that's one reason these bans are so serious, is because people say, well, once you're kicked off these platforms, you're gone, and that's it. So there's a lot more we need to know about how these platforms work, and that's one thing that I hope the government asks this year.
Yes, certainly sounds like a call for regulation, but you're saying too much unilateral power. Okay. So Alex, what about you? Step back. What do you think's going on? Is it right?
Yeah, I've tried to answer that question a lot over the past week. And I don't think we can say conclusively yet, because right now what we're going to experience is a lot of second order effects that I don't think are getting enough attention. So when you ban someone like Trump, when you ban QAnon, when you ban Stop the Steal off of Facebook, they eventually go somewhere else. And a lot of people went to Parler afterwards. Now Parler is banned. And so then where do they go from there? And all signs point to the fact that people are migrating toward messaging, secret messaging groups on apps like Telegram and apps like Signal, in some cases that are encrypted. And so the question is, do we end up having even more people going from a mode that some people in the Capitol went, where they move from shit posting to actually, engaging in violence? And does the fact that they move to these more insular, less accountable communities end up leading to more violence and leading to more extremism in this country? And I don't think we've solved that question yet. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that history doesn't end with a ban. And we're going to watch what the second order effects have in store for us over the coming months and years. And then I think, a little bit longer from now, we'll be able to go back and say whether they made the right decision or not. I mean, it's clear why they made the decision. I mean, they said it explicitly, which is that they felt that there was going to be more imminent violence as a result of allowing Trump to use his accounts. And maybe they were right. I mean, they gave him about as many chances as they possibly could before the Capitol riot happened, and then they pulled the plug. It is definitely not what these companies want to do. Like, they used to celebrate having world leaders on the platform, and now they have to kick one off. It's not sort of the dream that they had when they began. But obviously, it's a move that's extremely significant and will have ramifications down the line for a long time.
Okay, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, since your book ranged widely over a variety of companies, and particularly Amazon, which sort of gave you the title for your book, were you surprised to see Amazon kick Parler off AWS? I think that is kind of a first in terms of the policy reasons behind that action, as far as I'm aware. Is it a first as far as you know? And is it the right thing for a platform like AWS to behave that way?
Yeah, I don't I know that I feel like Gab has been kicked off of its servers. Gab is like sort of a parallel. They call themselves free speech networks. We know what that means. So, I mean, yes, you know, I was talking about this on my podcast this week with Ryan Mack. Like, if the point of having free expression is that, you know, at the end of the day, people will use that free expression to take away others' free expression. Are you actually, you know, a free speech network? Or are you something else? So we know Gab's been kicked off its servers. I'm not fully surprised that Parler got the boot. I think that one of the things we need to consider here is that these companies are going to be facing their employees. And we know from the data that's been gleaned from Parler that many active Parler users were in the Capitol on January 6th. And there was certainly, I mean, I was on the app. It didn't take a long time to find, you know, calls for civil war and things of that nature. So, you know, can Amazon then face its employees and say, look, we built the technology that enabled it? I don't know if they could. So to me, they had air cover from Apple, which removed Parler from the App Store and made it a lot easier for them to act. And then they just booted Parler right off. So whether it's a good move or not, again, I'm just going to fall back to that first answer. Where do the people from Parler go? Do they go to Telegram and Signal and start to plan some really nasty stuff? You know, it's really difficult to answer like with absolute certainty what the result of these moves are going to be.
Okay. Christine, you know, since your book called Reddit, the Internet's Culture Laboratory, what did you learn in studying Reddit, and what has Reddit learned that may shed light on where we stand?
Yeah, I was going to say, per Alex's point, it was fascinating writing about Reddit because every thread on Reddit is public, is kind of categorized, and is kind of stored as a historical. You can look back at anything that's ever been said. It's all there. Researchers can study it. They can search it, and making it a little more valuable for researchers of this sort of thing than even Twitter or Facebook. But when you have users now going to Signal or Discord or any other number of private communities, even email threads, us journalists and researchers have no access to it in the future either. So it's kind of painful as a journalist to see that happen, as well as scary and dangerous for our country. So I think that's a really valid thing to think about. Now, in terms of looking at Reddit's history, one of the major threads in my book was the history of content moderation and the formation of the ideas of how it should even be done, how it can be done. And that said, Reddit simply denied that there was any sort of theory or framework for doing it for years. And it was left to just, a handful of people, maybe 3, 4 for the vast majority of the company's history. And the site had a very free speech kind of founding theory, which was freedom from the presses. The internet and a site like Reddit doesn't need an editor. The people can upvote and downvote content, showing kind of what is most important or trendy of the day, based on the masses' opinions. Now, over years, that kind of free speech sentiment got taken a little too literally by one CEO in particular, and a lot of users chose to use Reddit as kind of a testing ground for how vile of content they could post online. And I think that sort of set a dangerous precedent for other sites, for kind of the theory of what the internet is, and what kind of extreme stuff people can get away with. It birthed like the incel movement and shit posting and all of that stuff that is, on one hand, stuff silly teenage boys do in their basements, and then on the other hand, over years can turn into this stuff that I couldn't imagine when I started writing my book. So it's really interesting the way those subtle zeitgeist patterns can play out online, and the theories can get taken to an extreme. And I think that's what we've seen. And I think we've seen years and years of Facebook and Twitter and the bigger tech companies not taking action in decisive ways that they clearly should have. That post 2016, Reddit actually showed the path to regulating, to kind of taking extreme measures in cutting off extremist groups. Post Charlottesville, the white extremist rally, they actually cut off most of those communities at that moment, which was an obvious moment to start looking at those groups and start making real moderation decisions that I don't think Twitter and Facebook really nailed down at that point.
Oh, great answer. So I noticed in the chat, two different people have made a point that I personally have made a lot in my own writing. I didn't even mention I wrote a book about Facebook, but it was so long ago, it hardly matters anymore. But the question is, what about the inconsistency of doing this in the United States, where these platforms are being abused by government leaders and hate speech politicians and just generally promoters of illegal and unethical behavior all over the world? So Sarah, this is something you and I've discussed, I know. Do you think that inconsistency is fundamentally hypocritical?
Yeah, I think that's a huge problem. I think that the problem of, you know, what Alex was talking about, these companies respond to what their employees want. And if your employees are embarrassed to go home for Thanksgiving and talk to their family and friends about the fact that they work for Facebook or Amazon or any of these companies, you're not going to be able to recruit the best talent. And so they do lean a lot more heavily on what happens in the US. It's their home market, it's where the CEOs live. And all of the tensions that happen elsewhere, they don't see having huge regulatory impacts for them. They don't see having a huge employee backlash problems for them. I mean, there was one instance last year with Facebook in India. It took a while for them to part ways with their head of that region, but you know, that was one of the only instances I can think of where there's some uprising internally about something happening outside the United States. So I think that's really crucial. I also wanted to touch on the encryption debate a little bit. I know that Christine and Alex have brought that up as you know, we could see the darkness move to encrypted apps. But I think the reason that we've seen these extreme ideas become mainstream, the reason we've seen somebody like Donald Trump ascend to the presidency and be able to foment them further, is because of the mechanisms of these platforms. And Alex has written about this, the reshare button on Facebook, retweeting, the fact that if you post something that excites people, whether that's emotionally making them angry, making them happy, surprising them, going against common knowledge, saying something out of that is the kind of thing that is going to recruit more followers to a movement. So if you do end up seeing these groups move to encrypted apps, it makes it harder for them to recruit more people to that idea. And that's one thing that a lot of even conservatives told me about Parler. It was a conservative echo chamber. It was kind of boring. There were no liberal tiers to incite on Parler. There was nobody to argue with, which makes it less fun. And part of what Reddit invented with shitposting is that's part of shitposting is making people mad, making people feel uncomfortable for laughs. And that is something that is fun for people on the internet, and it's not as fun on encrypted apps.
Yeah, well, let's just, you know, you sort of set up a question about Instagram because you're the world's leading expert on it. Instagram does not allow reposting and forwarding and a lot of the things that Facebook does.
But they do allow fame.
They allow fame. But do you think that would you agree, first of all, with the statement that some have made that Instagram is less of a haven for hate speech and political manipulation?
It is just as much of a haven, but those havens are hidden. They don't bubble up to the top as much.
So maybe as much of a haven, but not as much of a kind of accelerator of things.
Exactly. But you still see communities. I mean, I've been looking into the anti-vax movement right now, and Instagram is at the center of that. It's a wellness community on Instagram migrating to the fringe of anti-vax, and those influencers who people rely on for, you know, green juice recipes are now telling them that vaccines are made with chemicals that you don't want to put in your body. That's kind of what we're seeing on Instagram. We're seeing these people who have become lifestyle role models for others start to dispense medical advice, start to dispense political advice. And when you give anyone a microphone and you give them a way to become famous, that means that you're not always getting verified information. And so I think that they're beyond sort of the platform mechanisms of fame and sharing and going viral. I think there also needs to be a lot of education for humans of this world. This is how these platforms work. This is how you will be manipulated if you use them. I'm trying to get people to understand the incentives that people posting that incendiary content have to post it.
Okay, just one more Instagram question though, and that is, do you think if they have not allowed people to accelerate these evil messages as much as other systems, should other services like Facebook, would they be better off if they didn't allow the, retweet, or retweeting at Twitter or resharing at Facebook, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting to see the difference between how Twitter and Facebook handled a lot of Trump messages around the election. Twitter immediately would stop the resharing if they decided that something was spreading misinformation about the election outcome, whereas Facebook would allow the sharing and just put a label on it. The label doesn't really do anything. And I think we learned that over the course of the election, that if you're trying to prevent something from bubbling up to a bigger crisis, you probably should limit resharing. And that's not a free speech issue, by the way. People can say whatever they want, but they don't have a right to be amplified. They don't have a right to be distributed. And I think that is that's something that at least makes Instagram feel, you have to go seek out that stuff on Instagram if you want to find it. It doesn't come to you. And if you're on Facebook and Twitter, you see it all. It bubbles to the top. And that is what makes these misinformation movements bigger.
Yeah, good. Well, I think this issue of resharing and algorithms are both really key topics for us to discuss. I want to hear from you, Alex. And what I wanted today to say, though, is I'm hoping we're going to migrate this conversation as much as possible toward the question of what should be done. How could reforms happen? What new rules would be possible? So go on, say whatever you were going to say, but just with that in mind.
I mean, I'll just keep it quick. I think, building on what Sarah said, like, these platforms showed us exactly the problem. They know what the problem is. When people were getting killed off of misinformation on WhatsApp, what did they do? They limited the amount of times you could forward the message. It's basically the same thing as a share and retweet. Ahead of the 2020 election, Twitter knew there were issues with misinformation. And what did they do? They limited their people's ability to retweet. As soon as the election ended, they said, well, people retweeted less, so the experiment failed. We're putting it back. And I think that it's a shame that these platforms know the exact solution, but do not have the fortitude to take the action that is actually going to solve anything. And they've proven, like, time and time again, that they're not willing to make these moves, which I think we could all agree will just make the quality of information we consume better and make our society more healthy.
But wait, Alex, is it that they don't have the fortitude, or that they don't have the permission from their shareholders? Because if the value of these companies and their growth and their ability to show advertising is all conditioned upon page views and attention, they have an intrinsic financial incentive not to take some of those measures, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, a healthy society is a healthy Facebook. And so they've shown sometimes that they're willing to take action. For instance, they made a move in the algorithm to change us from watching video on the platform to engaging with friends and family, more comments and back and forth is what they wanted. They knew that time was going to go down, but they made that shift anyway. This would be a bigger change. And it would, I mean, there's definitely a financial side to it, no doubt about it. But, I think this is something where you just need to do it. Like, we know that Zuckerberg is not really responsive to Wall Street's concerns. There hasn't been a single board proposal he doesn't support that's made it through inside Facebook. So I don't see a situation where he could get ousted for doing the right thing, yet he doesn't do it.
Well, he'd lose wealth, but he might not be ousted. Christine, you mentioned algorithms. Would you just go down that path a little further? Because I think the question of algorithms, and if you could fold into that, this question of whether or not you think algorithms could or should be regulated in some fashion.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to add one note to what Sarah and Alex were just saying, which is that um, these there's so many layers to discuss in terms of how these companies function and what little tweaks they can make, and how they do them. Because even to look at the other side, the act of banning, a anti-vax post by a mommy blogger has had the effect in the past of further radicalizing some of their followers, saying, why is this content taken away from me? Why is this social network censoring something I love? And further driving those people toward more extremist content, which is interesting politically and should be considered too. I mean, there's just so many layers. But at the simplest layer, and Sarah got into this, the algorithm that Facebook is based on is one of allowing outrage to be amplified far more than other content, other emotional content. It is the emotion that spreads the farthest and gets people the most attention. And once it starts to get a person attention, they realize that and they feel rewarded for that and continue to post that sort of content. It also suggests various groups. The kind of groupification of Facebook has been a major factor in this sort of organizing we've seen online. And if Facebook, a few years ago when they decided to make those groups such a huge priority, that was, I think, a big shift and a significant one that deserves some regulatory scrutiny too. Those groups are now being sort of dismantled or taken down as they're spotted, but Alex's colleague Ryan Mack in BuzzFeed had a really great piece, I believe, today about Facebook running ads for body armor next to militia groups and continuing to do things like that. It's a deep problem that is so algorithmically complex. It's not just the outrage, which everyone hears about. It's about how they pair ads. It's about how they encourage group membership. And so I think the biggest kind of challenge we have going forward is, Congress has displayed time and time again that they don't have a deep understanding of how these things work. I mean, most people don't. As Sarah said, the companies are not transparent about them. How do we educate the folks who have the ability to regulate? And how do we get them transparent information?
That's a really, really good point. I am going to ambush Esther Dyson and ask her to say anything. I'm just allowing her to talk. She wrote one of the very first books about the internet that anybody wrote. She's been thinking about this stuff for as long as anyone I know. She's already thrown in a few side comments here. So I just want her to say anything. Esther, would you, if you're there, if you're not off, getting a cup of coffee? Hi.
Hi,
yeah,
Esther.
no, I'm here. This is fascinating. I mean, the problem isn't the algorithms, it's the people. And algorithms you can at least inspect, people you can't. I mean, the irony is we think AI is not transparent. People are even less transparent, whether that's your users or your board members and so forth and so on. So, but I'm sensitive to what David said. Stop whinging about the problems. What should we do as a solution? First of all, we should understand that there is no solution. If you want peace and absence of evil, kill everybody. Otherwise, we've got to deal with humanity. Yeah, I just, it's like this puts it in context. We need to deal with people the way they are. And I mean, I'm personally focused on more long-term things like education. But in the short term, I think, first, there's this we that we all use, which is smart people like us. And it's almost offensive to lots of other people. But at the same time, at some point, leaders have to have the temerity to lead and to say, this is wrong and this is right. These are the kinds of customers we want. These are the kinds of customers we're not afraid to offend. It is partly a thing of numbers. There are more people, the polls show it, who it took them a long time to come around to this perhaps, but no, it is not acceptable to invade the Capitol with arms and guns and blah, blah, blah. And in a sense, the people who are willing to be transparent just need to talk louder and take a stand and understand that this is still a fight. The more you can, I mean, I don't want revenge against Trump. I think probably he should go to an insane asylum and be cared for. But there are a lot of people around him who are acting out of greed or the seduction of power.
Okay, well, leave Trump out of it. Do you think there should be new laws telling these companies what they can and cannot do?
No. I mean, the laws, there may be some specific things we can tweak, but I think the moment you start with a law, you game it somehow. I think we need to ask people to behave with moral courage more than we need to create laws that will inevitably make it. Twitter, Facebook, the big guys, they'll figure out how to get around it one way or another. Whereas the small guys are going to have lots of problems, whether it's GDPR or content moderation. There are some interesting fixes with content moderation where before you comment, you have to moderate 3 other comments. And it just acts like a speed bump. And in a sense, we need to start looking at metabolism more than identity. You know, are these things being posted just in order to get ad revenues? And we need to call the companies to account, but not by passing laws that will kind of gamify it, but by actually, I think what they did this week was good. They behaved out of ethics rather than, oh, this is what the law says. And they said, this is unacceptable.
Good. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for all that. And let's not forget that Facebook and Google are already facing government antitrust lawsuits that threaten to literally break them up for not directly related reasons to what we're describing, although these issues are part of the discussion around that. It's more anti-competitive behavior. But I'd like all 3 of you to comment on, start with Alex. Should there be laws that we don't have now, and will there be laws? And to the degree you can say what laws might be helpful, fine. I know this is a big question, but Alex, then Sarah, then Christine.
Yeah, just to quickly riff off what Esther said, of course, it's not just the algorithms and it's not just the people either. It's a combination of both. And what these platforms do is incentivize certain behaviors. You notice that people will behave differently on TikTok and on Instagram and on Twitter and on Facebook. And I think the platforms with the particularly bad behavior, need to look at the way that their machinery works, not just what it spits out, and try to fix it that way. In terms of legislation, I think that we're going to see renewed bipartisan antitrust pushes when Biden becomes president, because you already had so in the last 4 years, you had the Democrats take the issue of big tech antitrust really seriously and do actually significant work that made it into the DOJ and FTC cases against Google and Facebook in their antitrust subcommittee, looking at competition specifically, not trying to game the system by yelling at Section 230. So the Democrats are already on board, and they're probably there because they were pissed off about what happened in 2016. But an interesting thing happened over the past few days, which is that, Apple and Amazon used their power the way they did, obviously Facebook and Twitter too. And so I think you're going to start to see Republicans come on board and push for not only action from the regulators, but also significant legislation, and start to review some of the things the Democrats said and say, okay, maybe we're actually more warm to this than we were beforehand, because now we've seen the power in action. So in terms of what laws I think they should look at, I think we have an issue where these tech companies are both the market and the player. I mean, if you think about Amazon, right? It has the first party marketplace. It has the platform where all the third party merchants sell through. It has the data from all of the sales, and then it builds its own brands. And right now that's totally fine. And I think that the next legislative session, we might see some more action, or at least laws drafted that try to take aim at that side of the business. And if you look through, think about Google and the search results. It's the marketplace and it's the player. It's the same thing. So I think we're going to see stuff, along that front. And then, I think it's less likely that we're going to see breakups, but breakups might actually address some of the things we're talking about. You started asking at the beginning of the discussion, are these companies too powerful? when you think about Amazon, big first party marketplace, third party marketplace, logistics operation, Amazon Web Services, a hardware division with the Echo and Kindle, voice computing, with the A word, which I'm not going to say because I'm going to set it off, grocery store, an Academy Award winning movie studio. I don't see how anyone can argue that a company like that worth $1.6 trillion isn't too powerful. So I think we will see that push. And we'll see where things take aim, where people take aim at, because the rules right now are completely different than they were a week ago. And so you're going to see action.
Okay. Sarah, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that in order to see action from these companies, I think they might respond more to the carrot than the stick, because we've seen what the stick looks like. It looks like 10 hours of testimony in front of Congress where the CEOs get asked questions by people who have very limited knowledge about how they actually work. We've seen the FTC $5 billion fine, which included a lot of backroom negotiations between Facebook and the FTC to soften it. And ultimately, the FTC just asked Facebook to do things that they were already doing. The fundamental problem with these companies is they have only one North Star, which is growth. Success is growth. More users, more revenue, more engagement, more profit, more employees. Every quarter, they're trying to get more. And unless there is another North Star, unless there is another definition of success, I don't see very much changing. I mean, even with Alex mentioned the great sacrifice that Facebook made to shift the algorithmic incentives from groups to comments. Well, look what's happening in the comments. That's where everyone's fighting about politics right now. And every time someone mudslings about, whether the election was stolen, that post that has all the mudslinging on it ends up at the top of everyone's feed and just further spreads the vitriol. And so I think that we have to be careful what we wish for. If we put things in the hands of the companies to try to fix the problem, they're not always going to do it in a way that works, because even if they change their formulas, the ultimate North Star is growth. So that's kind of, I'm not sure exactly how we get there, but I think there needs to just be a rethinking of what success for these guys should look like, and how do we get there?
Okay, Christine, any thoughts on this?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the conversation will move from Trump to antitrust, and I also think that for sure there's this huge rallying cry right now against Section 230. I mean, how we conceived of the bones of the internet in 1996 is very different than how they exist now, and I think that it's controversial, but I think it does need to be tackled. I don't know that the Biden administration or Congress will take this key moment in time and do that in the next 180 days, but I think that it's worth looking at, and I do think that there's good movement in Congress to kind of carve out a place in that to give small business, the smallest businesses, an exemption from that, which is interesting. My colleague Amrita Khalid has a really good piece on Inc.com today that lays out some of those options that you could check out. But I don't know. There's other people have proposals that may help Congress. I just talked to Sinan Aral from MIT, who really suggests making a panel or commission of the folks who are best able to study this and to make recommendations. I think that's wise. That's easy, and they might be able to help inform Congress on a path forward here.
Good. It doesn't seem like this is going to be one of the top issues in the first 100 days, and understandably. On the other hand, a lot of the other problems we have can be tied in some way or another to this, which I don't think can be denied. Sort of related to what Sarah was just saying too, or all of you have touched on this. Sam Lessin at The Information wrote a very highly opinionated and much attended to article this week, where essentially he predicted the dissolution of the internet if we continue on the path of especially what Facebook and companies like Stripe did, Amazon and companies like Stripe did, going beyond just regulating speech and making somewhat what he thought of as arbitrary decisions about what services were allowed to operate and what websites were allowed to operate on the internet, and that would lead to a tremendous sort of copycat phenomenon globally, where it will be just used to justify coming down on political dissenters in many other parts of the world. But his solution ultimately was that the sites themselves need to adopt what he called simple laws and policies they can enforce consistently and uniformly, which sounds so good. And yet, to me, it sounds probably not to mention, certainly unlikely, but probably impossible. The sites often already would say they're doing that. I just love any of you to respond to that notion. Is it possible that a lot of this could be remedied by a voluntary adoption of much more clear-cut and consistently enforced rules on,
Wait,
on
David,
how these?
This is a question about your Facebook book. What was the first, wasn't it Don't Be an Asshole? There was like some very simple, clear-cut moderation in the early days of Facebook, and now they have pages and pages and PowerPoints of rules.
Right, well, that's right. But Facebook has just, as they've grown, I think, as they've grown larger and as they've grown greedier and as the money has grown more important to them, they've tried as hard as they can to stay away from any real tough decisions about what should and should not be allowed, even despite making tons of disingenuous statements about how hard they're trying. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about Facebook is how many senior people have been fleeing in the last year or so, and then saying publicly things like, all Facebook cares about is PR, and if they get a PR hit, then they might change something, but they have no consistently enforced rules. One of the people who left was involved in global, my biggest criticism of Facebook is one that one of their departed people made. They just totally disregard harmful speech in countries where they're not getting a PR hit. And in India, it's their biggest country. They're more susceptible to PR hits there than any other country aside from the United States, which is why they've done some tweaking of their leadership and other things there. But I have no respect for Facebook's ability or willingness to adopt consistent rules, none whatsoever. I think Jack Dorsey, on the other hand, is trying much harder. And I'd be curious what you all thought about his statement this week, where he basically is acknowledging the decision he made wasn't a good one and it leads to problems. But he's at least throwing up his hands and saying, look, I know I'm in a tough spot. I shouldn't be making these decisions. And then he actually is arguing for some kind of maybe open source set of protocols for social that Twitter would then subscribe to. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that let's talk about Facebook and Twitter. So I think Sam is living in a fantasy world if he thinks that you can set clear rules and just enforce them. So each piece of content falls clearly into a category. I mean, take Trump's video while people were in the Capitol. What did he say? He said, everybody needs to be peaceful, go home. And he said, I love you, you're very special. So you can, how would you apply a rule to that? I mean, you can take a look at the words. He tells them to go home. Is saying I love you to someone, who might be committing a crime, is that something that's objectionable speech? Who's to say? And then, what really happens next is it's not exactly what he says, it's how the people who receive it interpret it. So you can watch these, communities of people who went into the Capitol, and they go into the text and they try to dissect it. And they say, well, he loves us, so therefore it means that we should have gone on. And in fact, when you looked at the way that Twitter explained its permanent ban of Trump, it wasn't because of what he said. It was because of how people were interpreting it. They looked at something that said, like, I'm not planning to go to the inauguration. And people in the forums are saying, well, that means this election is illegitimate. And then do people down the line then say, well, we need to take, action with arms and prevent the election from being stolen? And Twitter eventually believed that that was too much of a risk to allow him back on the platform. So then, like, what clear speech rule do you use to say, okay, that's good or not? Does it mean that if you say I'm not going to attend an inauguration, you're kicked off permanently? I just think there's too much gray area to implement something that, like Sam is talking about.
Either of you? Any further thoughts? I see Ludwig Siegel here. I'm trying to get him to come on and say something because he's another really deeply informed observer of all this stuff. But if you're there, Ludwig, respond to me in the comments. I thought the Twitter statement about why they kicked him off was one of the most subtly argued things that I have seen from any of these companies ever.
It was
Because
great.
and it was something that Facebook would be utterly incapable of. You know, saying, for example, by saying I'm not going to be at the inauguration, that was actually an invitation to potentially attack the inauguration. That was pretty thoughtful analysis by the standards of these companies.
Yeah, well, as someone who reports on CEOs and entrepreneurs constantly, I love one who's thoughtful about their decisions and who's sort of transparent about the unsure nature of some of these decisions. The kind of okay, I did a thing that I believe is right at the moment, and that could change. You know, these things are fluid, and I think it shows flexibility in decision making and in changing one's mind is a great characteristic that we should be looking for. And I don't think Zuckerberg has really ever shown that sort of growth, which is a little scary in itself. But yeah, we saw a little bit of that from Jack Dorsey, and we've seen that from people like Cloudflare's Matthew Prince in the past. You know, he kind of agonized over the decision to ban, I forget if it was 4chan or 8chan, and that was like a weeks long process. And he's in the New York Times saying, I don't know, it kept me up last night, so I banned them this morning, and I think that was wrong. And you know what? This is a big, complex, crazy issue, and I think that it is a major crisis for our democracy that we deserve to all be able to wrestle with.
One of the things that I think we learned in the Trump versus Clinton election was that people don't like focus grouped communication. People don't really like it when somebody is only telling you exactly what they think you want to hear. Like we saw, you know, Facebook would say every time they launch a product, privacy is at the root of everything we do. No, it's not. But they say that because they think that's what you want to hear. And so I think that, yeah, I also appreciated Twitter looking at the context, not just the content. Whereas I think Facebook's application of its policies is always extremely textualist. Like, well, you know, is the looting leads to shooting actually a racist dog whistle? We looked and we couldn't find direct evidence, so we'll err on the side of caution. Like that was their reasoning, and I think that that's why they didn't take that down, and that resulted in an employee walkout. So
say whatever you will about the Twitter decision, the explanation was good. Like they went deep into the text and explained what was going on, even giving a particular date that they thought there would be more violence signaled by the statements. So,
and let's face it, I mean, does anyone here disagree with the fact that each of these companies does, at least the conversational platforms, have the unilateral right to let anything be allowed or not allowed? It's their unilateral right. I think it's a little more complicated for AWS myself, but does anybody disagree that Facebook and Twitter can take down anything they want, and it's not a matter of free speech, it's a matter of how they manage their own private environment?
Yeah, it's their living room, so it's up to them whether you can sit in it and say whatever you want.
Yeah, well, we are really pretty much out of time. Oh, Josh is back. Okay. This has been great. It is vexing. And I am so pleased and honored that the three of you joined us today. I'm glad we recorded it. There's a lot here to chew on, and maybe we'll find ways of chewing on it further. It scares me that it's so complicated and there seems to be such a lack of a clear path forward. But at least we have a new administration that seems to take matters of governance more seriously. So that's a good thing. Josh, take it away.
Hey, great. Yes. Thank you, Alex, Sarah, Christine. Thank you for joining us. for those of you who did ask in the chat, we will be editing and making this video available on our YouTube channel probably early next week. So we'll make sure to post it. Please share it with colleagues, people who are all sort of intrigued by this topic. We'll make sure in the follow-up email, we'll have information about everyone's book, as everyone has a book available. So we'll do that as well. And we'll look forward to seeing you at future roundtables. As I mentioned, we'll be telling you about some of our other events, our Worth event, Women in Worth, our Accelerate CDX event, as well as the upcoming roundtable. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great weekend, long weekend for those of you who have Monday off, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Great
you.
discussion.